So this is a fun room, and we have a fun first panel to kick it off with today. We have HTML, HTML5, and the future of the web. So hopefully this is where you want to be. We're going to get started. Let's kick it off to our moderator.
Thanks. So we figured we'd just have a good conversation with the room here about the subject. We'll open up for questions pretty early. But first I wanted to introduce my panelists. We have Tarik Kurspahic, who has a background in web cartography, and I'll allow him to explain his background and some of the things he's been working on. And we've got Andrew Nacin from WordPress. Myself, my background, I'll get to after the fact. I come from a company called MetaLayer. We build practical big data applications for corporations. Prior to that, I worked with an organization called Ushahidi, which makes open source mapping technologies for disaster response primarily. So Andrew, we'll start with you and work our way back down.
Sure. My name is Andrew Nacin. I'm one of the lead developers of WordPress based here in DC. This is a really big conversation to have here. A lot of people see future of the web, and then they also see, I think it's future of mobile, and they wonder what the difference is. And I think that's actually a really interesting thing that we can be talking about today when we're looking at all of these different technologies, really across the board, what the HTML5 APIs and what a lot of the other advancement here in the web can actually be doing for the future of web or mobile or social, I guess, if I just want to say every pivot buzzword possible. Is everyone awake this morning? Like, not at all, right? Okay. So I'm one of the lead developers of WordPress. I primarily focus on back-end architecture, which is interesting in a front-end talk. But one of the things that we keep seeing is that we're seeing so much code move from the back-end space right into the front-end space. So stuff that we were previously doing in the back-end, we can now be doing pretty much entirely in JavaScript. Some of the stuff we were doing in JavaScript, we can do entirely in CSS. Some of the stuff we can do in CSS, we're doing entirely in markup. We have better tools for that we can actually target for the right job now. It's a lot different than anyone here who is working with CSS 1.0 or maybe even 2 back about 8-9 years ago when you're designing pretty much around Internet Explorer 6. We don't really need to do that anymore. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, does anyone here actually support Internet Explorer 6 anymore and what they're doing? Not a single hand. One. I am so sorry. 0.6. Unfortunately, now we have IE7 and IE8 as the new Internet Explorer 6. So, like 5 years, it'll be IE9. Then another 5 years, it'll be IE10. We're still going to be having to build around these different browser vendors. But a lot of the stuff that we're seeing with WordPress and a lot of the usage is that people are really trying to find the best browsers possible for their experience. So if you're on a browser with an update track, everything is working really, really quickly. And it's nice because when new APIs are coming, we can start using them within 2 to 3 months of them coming out. So I'm going to stop talking at this point and kick it back.
Great. And Tarik?
Hey, hi, guys. My name is Tarik Kurspahic. I am the CTO of Personal.com. So at Personal, you know, we believe definitely the way forward, the future is in personal data. And it's kind of it's a bit of a telling sign. Excuse me. A bit of a telling sign that if you look at sort of the API Billionaires Club, which, you know, you'll find names like Facebook, Google, Netflix, Twitter, that about half of those actually deal with our own personal data. So as far as, you know, future of the web and where this stuff is going, I definitely think each and every one of you, first of all, as a user, but then also as a developer, will have a huge, huge role to play. By way of background, I'm a technologist. You know, since the early days of the C64, I've been telling machines what to do, and I absolutely love it. So at Personal, I'm on my third platform, and I really do kind of everything from back-end architecture, from the database on up through the entire stack, of course, to the UI, and which is where we meet HTML5. And so I think another interesting thing to talk about is the emergence of things like HTML5 boilerplate and Bootstrap as really tools that have aggregated kind of the best practices around dealing with these problems that Andy just laid out for us with browser compatibility and such. And then looking also at sort of the new capabilities in HTML5, because a lot of the new stuff that's happening has to do with visualization, so the Canvas API and so on. So I guess I'll cut it off there too.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you guys. Speaking of visualization, so at MetaLayer, we do a lot of work in that space, particularly around the issues of making data more usable by non-technical users. So we do a lot of work in countries where the level of sophistication of working with data may not be so technical. So the easiest way to translate these concepts and the abstractions to the users through visualization. So we do a lot of jQuery, a lot of mapping platforms, a lot of JavaScript. Similarly, at Ushahidi, they use a lot of open frameworks and open standards. And so as it's just sort of like a first foray into this conversation. By the way, if you ever have questions during this time together, just raise your hand and we'll call you. You don't have to wait until the end. So as a first question, what do you think about the rise of open standards and HTML5 being one of many that you guys have worked with? Where do you see things headed?
So,
as it relates to your work?
Yeah, sure. So, Personal has a broad mission, and we have sort of a consumer-facing face, and then we have the developer-facing aspect. And then from the API perspective, I guess one sort of standard that's been emerging is OAuth 2. It's got a couple of nice properties. The biggest one, of course, is that since both Facebook and Twitter have adopted that, if you've ever built on top of their APIs, you're familiar with it.
I think I've heard of those.
What's that?
I think I heard of those.
Yeah, exactly. So embracing things like that will definitely help you as developers because you're going to have developers that are like familiar with the stuff and can day one start building on your thing and just have to figure out a little bit about it. On the other side, like I was saying, especially when you're first starting out, I guess you can look at sort of the trajectory that a company faces. And when you first start out, you're not even 100% sure what your product is going to do. And if you get too far into the weeds and build very specific functionality very quickly across a wide variety of browsers, you're eventually going to get stuck where you have to kind of reset and do a lot of things over. And that's where I think the emergence of things like HTML5 boilerplate and Bootstrap, I'm a huge fan of Bootstrap, and jQuery for manipulating DOM and getting access to various parts of your page have just made this so much easier. You can actually concentrate on what it is your product is supposed to do as opposed to dealing with sort of the nuances of each and every particular browser.
Yeah, the guy from WordPress hasn't yet mentioned open source as a big change here in where we're going, and it is in many cases we're dealing with open data, we're dealing with finally open protocols in a lot of cases. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, used to work with Flash primarily. How many of you are really working with Flash, other than the one person over there who's still working with IE? Okay, this is really interesting. If you look at HTML, you look at JavaScript, you look at CSS, 10 years ago, you never would have considered them to be open. Sure, like the standards, the specs, they're out there. But no one was really contributing to them. No one was able to contribute to them. No one was able, even if you could contribute to them, you're really influencing decisions that wouldn't have happened that wouldn't have gone into effect for 5, 6, 7 years down the line. So there was really no incentive for a lot of developers to get into that space. Now what you're seeing is you have all of the browser makers at one table trying to come up with these standards. And in many cases, their browsers are open. In the case, certainly, of to an extent, you have Chrome, Safari, and Firefox are all being developed in the open right now. And now they're actually they can be held accountable for evolving all of these different standards. So you have more or less, like, you're no longer dealing with Flash, you're still dealing with 5 major companies all fighting at the same table. But at the same time, we're finally able to affect a lot of these changes, which is obviously great. the more things that are open source, the better. The browser wars are finally open, and we can actually understand what's going on, rather than just Microsoft and Netscape and making decisions back and forth, trying to support their own internal APIs. Now there really aren't many more proprietary formats or APIs that we're dealing with. Everything is in the open, and open is really winning.
Just building on that, would you still say fragmentation is a problem, or is it being solved quickly enough by this new conversation?
Fragmentation continues to be a problem. We're finally at the point where the latest browsers across, let's say, the 5 main browsers don't suck, which is a good start, right? Like, that's like the first step, is finally the browser that is installed by default on every PC in the world is at least workable for what we're trying to do. The nice thing about, or the one thing that you can get away out of fragmentation is that we still need to be developing it in a form of progressive enhancement, because you're no longer fragmented across 5 desktop browsers. You're now fragmented across mobile devices, tablets, and everything else. People are consuming their data so many different ways now. So just when you thought, oh great, now I can just design for WebKit and Firefox and I'm good to go, well, even though WebKit might be powering pretty much every mobile browser right now, that doesn't mean that it's going to work all the same. You're still dealing with very different browsers when you go from the Kindle to the iPad to any of the Android tablets, to pretty much every single Android phone is going to have some sort of a quirk. So you were at the point originally where I was like, great, now I can keep all of these thoughts in my head as to, you know, I have like the dartboard with IE with like Internet Explorer set up, and I really only need to remember all the quirks there. And now it's like, now we're looking at mobile, and that's just fragmenting everything else all over again.
Right. And we had a brief conversation before where we talked about the added layer of Retina display and having to deal with that now. And, you know, going down this sort of wormhole of layers upon layers of interoperability.
Well, I mean, this is one example where the browser makers, the device makers, and the standards bodies haven't come together on any sort of agreement. If anyone has tried to implement high DPI or Retina on any of their websites or applications, it's terrible. There's no good experience for it. It's the whole thing. The support across the entire web for Retina is a hack, and it will remain a hack until everyone gets together to figure out what the next solution is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite clear that you know, we're having to hack our way around things, and one of the sort of things that's emerged from this are libraries like Modernizer, right? So now it's not just the browser makers themselves, but we have an active community that's trying to help developers work their way around these quirks and kinks. And then additionally, I would say it's not even just, you know, desktop and mobile anymore, but now, you know, gaming consoles are shipping with browsers, and people are actually starting to consume internet on those. And, you know, you've got your Apple TVs and like all sorts of devices that you never would sort of really plan for in advance. But I saw this one slide from Adrian Cockcroft, who's one of the main architects at Netflix, and just the slew of devices that they deliver movies to. It's just amazing. You almost wouldn't believe that many actual devices existed that can consume that stuff. So I think, you know, there's definitely an explosion, and I think we'll face even more explosion of fragmentation with, like, you know, Google TV and now Apple TV and all these other devices. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it brings up the question, the debate really, that HTML5 is either too fragmented or too early to become a standard. There's the issue, the example of Facebook backing off of HTML5 and going native, mobile native.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think certainly on mobile. Again, I'm going to go back a little bit to the timeline of each company and, like, you know, how well you know the product that you actually want to put out. Because once you start supporting multiple devices, it's a huge investment. So the beauty of the HTML5 standard is it lets you actually write mostly one set of code to cover a wide variety of devices and sort of degrade somewhat gracefully, right? There's always going to be quirks, you know, whether it's things like rounded corners, and, you know, some of us can be pretty picky about how we do our UI. But things are always going to degrade, and I think for the handset manufacturers and iOS in particular, I think native has always been a better experience. It's much quicker, it's much faster. So in a way, I guess it's maybe not even in their best interest to really support HTML5 as the standard, because they want the best possible user experience for their set of users, right? So I think early on, it's a great way of sort of supporting a huge variety of devices. But as Facebook has shown, they can do much faster, much better when they decide to
Going
fully
native.
support.
Yeah.
So a few different things. I mean, one of the interesting things about native applications is that they're better, but it is because they're faster. But it's in many cases that they can do more. And there are a lot of really great things that have come out of HTML5. So really, I mean, to get into the nitty gritty, you're looking at the history API, you're looking at WebSockets, web workers. You're looking at HTML5 audio and video, which ideally should be making it easier for across all devices to be shipping this stuff. There are different APIs like content editable, drag drop. Some of the things that are noticeably absent, though, not just out of the spec, but really in terms of what you can do out of a browser, is can you control your phone's camera from a browser? You can't yet. Until iOS 6, you couldn't upload photos from your browser. And I mean, it's not a very good experience right now to upload something in a browser. Forget about doing that from a phone. And so what you're seeing in many cases is these native applications are just able to integrate so much better with the operating system that at this point, it's an extension of your hand, while HTML5 is just kind of almost like a lame extension of the browser. So there are a lot of really cool tools that we can be doing, but at the same time, they're moving fast enough for a lot of things, but ultimately still they can't actually even access the certain areas that we want them to be able to do for it to work really across the board.
And then I think that's actually a perfect point, because like I was saying earlier, where Modernizer tries to fill some of the gaps around dealing with like the differences in the gap between the different browser, there is sort of this new breed of applications called hybrids that's emerging, right, on mobile, where you have this very thin wrapper around your HTML5 application, and the wrapper deals with the stuff like accessing device-specific hardware, accelerometers, things like that, and also frameworks like PhoneGap, if anybody's used that, that will help you get at some of these device-specific functions that you can't normally access from HTML. So again, that's like another, more fragmentation that we're seeing, because this need went unfulfilled, and somebody else is filling it. So
and this kind of leads into security in many ways as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm a news junkie, and I might click through an article, and I end up on a random newspaper website in New Jersey, and they immediately say, "Hey, can we know your location?" That isn't a good experience, but it's a required experience for now. Until we can kind of get this idea of at what point do you opt in to everyone knowing where you are. The idea of geolocation in HTML5 is a really interesting one. I mean, so in WordPress, we can actually use this for, detecting your time zone. Especially, we can figure out exactly where you are, and we can set that. That's great when you're working in a dashboard, but when you're just browsing a website, geolocation is a completely different aspect. It's a lot different than when you're opening up the Foursquare app. Obviously, you're giving them by downloading the application, you've already said, yes, I would like to opt in to use my Wi-Fi, use my GPS, use whatever you need to do to figure out where I am. And HTML5 is just kind of like, well, can I do this, please? Even though it's completely not relevant to what I'm doing. And that really, I mean, we're actually kind of evolving more into the future of mobile talk that's happening right now. But
Also relevant, the future of the web is mobile, some say. So you're getting into a very interesting subject, though, which is implied consent versus explicit consent, which, as geolocation becomes part of the standard, is it on by default? Do we have the ability to opt out ever?
Personal, my company was founded in part because of, I think, how badly certain actors have been behaving when it comes to our personal data. and the fact that you just can't trust every company to have access to this and all the things that they're going to, potentially do with it. But even less sort of as bad actors and more just being inclusive, of the users. And people talk a lot about, no, users are making a clear choice, that they're choosing to see my advertising and to be tracked for a free service. That's not actually a button you click on and say, hey, here's the free version. And if you click this button, you're signing up for, I'm going to track you and I'm going to deliver some ads. And, you promise to click through a few of those versus, pay $5 here a month or whatever it is for the service. So it's definitely not, we're not in the sort of consent stage, but I think users have to have a choice. And I think the proliferation of there's just a huge boom in APIs. They're growing exponentially. So in about 2005, we had maybe 1,000 different APIs registered on programmable web. Sort of as of, I think, May this year, there were 7,000. So, with Amazon Web Services, anybody can stand up an API, and each of these people handle security and privacy very differently. Some do it well, some don't even bother, and it's not even a checklist item when it comes to that. So if we are going to be hooking into each other's APIs to sort of expand the capabilities of our software, I think users, implicitly, if I have access, then, do 50 other APIs that I use on my site have access to that as well. So I think we're going to have to ask users.
Yeah. Any questions from the room? Or pushback on any of the things that we've been talking about?
Hand went right up for that. So for WordPress, we actually follow along in most of their conversations. They're a bit more high level for us in the sense that you're having a lot of browser vendors all talking in the same room. So a lot of us, for example, follow most of their conversations, but we don't, for example, have a voting voice there. That said, they've actually done a lot of interesting stuff recently on accessibility guidelines, and specifically web authoring guidelines, which they. Originally, they wrote all these guidelines in a way that they might have 8 or 9 years ago, in the sense that no one who does web authoring was really consulted, in many cases, I think that's starting to finally change. In the sense that here's a working draft, and let's actually talk about how we can make web authoring a standard. And web authoring kind of carries in many cases to something like content editable in HTML5. I mean, the idea that you can double click an area on a page and just start editing it. That's pretty cool. It's going to take a bit longer for that to happen, but I mean, WordPress would probably like to use a feature like that, I would think. But yeah, so I mean, in the sense that, are we able to influence indirectly through a lot of the people that we know and across those browser vendors? So, for example, we're able to kind of try and figure out, okay, so we maybe have this good solution for retina or high DPI. Let's write a blog post on it. Let's start shipping this around. Let's get the right people to read it. But in terms of a seat at the W3C table, no. That said, I don't know if we necessarily would want a seat at that table either. So
yeah, I think also we'd need to find better avenues than like sort of each developer who's had some problems going out to a standards body and trying to talk about it. I think there, with the natural emergence of things like Bootstrap and HTML5 boilerplate, there is actually a really good core around which individual developers can contribute to that, and they do, with ideas and everything. And then from there, you can sort of deduce where the majority of developers are heading and what are their needs and so on, which can then get worked into the standards themselves. So I think there's, a little bit of a cascading path to that versus sort of one-on-one and just flooding everything with comments. Like we're starting to see some patterns emerge.
And I don't mean to trump up blogging, but I do. But when you look at the idea of just being able to finally just, I mean, you're able to write and actually influence the course of these actions and the decisions. I mean, you do one solid post on the direction of where HTML5 should go in one area. It might get picked up by Hacker News. It might get read by the right people, and it can actually take off. But I mean, you mentioned something like HTML5 boilerplate. Yep. As an example, one of the developers for that is Paul Irish, who is on the Chrome developer relations team. They're listening to a lot of these things. So I mean, 5-6 years ago, if you wanted to complain about something, you were at this point where it's like, okay, well, we're at this HTML5 working draft spec or the HTML4 spec in many cases. There's no roadmap forward. Now there is, to the point where things are getting approved and shipped in browsers in like 3 or 4 months, which is as fast as we're cranking out major releases for WordPress. So how can we be, how fast can we actually start to adopt stuff? And it kind of gets to the point where what version of Facebook do you run? You don't really know, right? I mean, they've revised that damn newsfeed like 17 times. But what version of Chrome do you run? Now, 4 years ago, you would have been able to answer that question. Well, I guess it didn't exist 4 years ago, but you would know what version of Firefox you were on, 3.5, 3.6. And now Chrome, I mean, I think it's on 23. Probably no one else knew that. And then you look at, so now what version of WordPress do you run? So how fast can we actually start updating our web applications? What version of the HTML5 spec is being used these days? They actually removed versions off it. It now is just, it's constantly in a working state now. They're just adding stuff to it, and it's considered, okay, we're good to go. So that kind of continuous advancement can obviously go a long way.
At the present right now, we're kind of at a juncture where you want to ship a web product that works across a bunch of different devices. You have to use polyfills. Like you're going to be using, like you said, boilerplate, CSS resets, et cetera, probably like 400 or 500 lines of code in some cases before you ever even write anything that's specific to your product. Are we moving towards a future where those polyfills are going to kind of become absorbed into the native browser code? Are we ever going to see paragraph tags displayed exactly the same across all major browsers? Or are we always going to be sitting on this sort of nasty layer of polyfill in between product and native code?
I'm with you. Unfortunately, it's a question for the browser makers, but as I was hinting at earlier, I think these things are clearly hinting at developers' needs and wants, and it would make all of our lives much easier if the browser vendors could just agree and do this, and then we didn't need the boilerplate and like you said, it's kind of a pain to get a project going. In our case, for example, our product does not link live to any third-party sites because we don't want to be phoning any user information back to anyone. So for us, you also have to download, and then you have to deal with the upgrades because we're not linking directly to the latest and greatest version of whatever JavaScript API we're using. So unfortunately, it's a question for them. I do hope that with the emergence and sort of masses moving towards one or two of these frameworks that have similar APIs, that the browser vendors are going to get extremely smart and pick off those features and talk when they do it, as opposed to having 3 ways to specify rounded corners and one not at all. So that HTML6 may be much more friendly and standard across the different browsers.
Well, that's kind of the nice thing about this whole evolving standard of HTML5 is that they're at the moment they're saying there won't be an HTML6. We're just going to keep evolving 5 for as long as we can go. So the good thing is they don't need to change that logo that they have, and they're pretty much just set on that. So HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript. I mean, who knows at this point where they're going with that? But if you wanted to know, ECMAScript 6 is the big one. And so actually, to get into polyfills, it's actually interesting that the differences between browsers are becoming less when you're looking at one platform. But then when you start to look at different device sizes, that's really where something like HTML5 boilerplate can help a lot. So the idea of whether you're designing desktop first or mobile first, that can go a long way to just making that easier. It's not just about papering over the differences of browsers anymore. It's actually about providing a really solid base framework. With that, though, one thing that can be nice is that something like a CSS reset is really just resetting CSS that the browser is applying. So whether or not there might be a situation in the spec where we can actually specifically say don't load the browser styles at all, at the very least, it is a browser style sheet. It is CSS in the sense that, you look at Firefox, a lot of Firefox is now built in HTML and CSS. A lot of Chrome is built in HTML and CSS. You can style the Chrome of Chrome, if you will, using the same styles that you would do with a web page. In the sense that default browser style sheet that gets applied, you can look at, you can inspect, and then you can modify. It's really nice because that CSS reset isn't really guessing anymore. It's not resetting every possible property because the margin might be used in one browser and padding might be used in another. So we can be a lot smarter about it, which I think is probably the best advantage to having a lot of these open standards now.
And so before the panel, we talked a bit about sort of where WordPress itself was heading, and you had a lot of interesting things to say there about adopting some of the HTML5 APIs. Do you want to elaborate on that just a bit, Andrew?
Sure. So does anyone remember Google Gears?
Yes.
Yeah. It was the idea where you can basically cache stuff offline, but it required quite a bit of work, and actually Google Chrome never supported it. As far as I remember, I don't think it ever supported it.
Almost.
Did it for a bit?
They shipped a plugin for it.
They shipped a plugin for it. And so the idea behind Google Gears originally was just this idea of like a cache manifest. And with HTML5, with application cache, we can go so much further with this now. When we're dealing with actual local storage, we're not just storing like, here's your static assets, store them to disk. We're dealing with, here's all of your dynamic content and all of the things that you're working on, and we can store them. So if you look at something like offline Gmail, it's not a great experience yet, but the idea that you can, without internet, if you're ever in a situation where without internet now, which is increasingly less, if you can go ahead and just write an email or reply to an email and automatically sync that up later, that's a nice experience to happen right in your browser. You're no longer dealing with something like Outlook. We're actually getting rid of the native application in this sense. So for something like WordPress, I imagine a number of you probably use WordPress on a fairly regular basis. We're getting to the point where you should never lose your content again. And we're already really good about that with trying to autosave your content and doing a lot of other things. But we're at the point where every keystroke you type, we can now save to local storage, and you're never going to lose a draft. You can go ahead if you don't have internet, you can spin up WordPress and just start typing a draft up. So we could do it for an emergency fallback. We could do it for this subpar offline Gmail experience where if you are on the go and you want to write something, you can go ahead and do that. Some of the other stuff that I found to be really cool is obviously content editable, because that is in many cases where the future can lie. This idea of modifying a website by literally just modifying it. We're not even dealing with the web inspector or Firebug or something like this anymore. We're dealing with this idea where someone can go ahead to a content area and say, I want to change this. And then WordPress in this case could just say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll save that. That's not a problem. This is really easy to do. And so, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing actually is our real expansion plans right now have to do with international. Almost 50% of our users are using WordPress in a language other than English. And that doesn't really actually play too much into HTML5. But for us especially, if you're looking at bloggers in Iran, their internet's kind of slow over there. And if we're able to use stuff like application cache and whatnot to actually speed things up, that can actually go a long way. We're kind of used to 50 megabits down or something, whatever it might be. They're not. And for them to load that really slow web page, for them to use a web application, it's a really bad experience. And if we can make that pretty much instant, that's a very good experience.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's also an emergence of JavaScript APIs that try to handle things like client-side changes, instant update, and then try to write back asynchronously to the server, and then should the call fail, you readjust your UI. But I'd love to go back just for a second to the app cache thing, because just like we've had SSL for a really long time, HTTPS. But it was amazing to me that somebody could write one little Firefox extension called Firesheep, and my dad could walk into a Starbucks and grab all your Facebook accounts if he wanted to, right? And I think now that we're getting more power with more APIs, it's even more of a responsibility of each and every one of us to take security and privacy really seriously. So I feel there's also a need for sort of a set of APIs at the browser level that would allow you, so for example, you might, let's say you push everything to the app cache, right? How sensitive is that blog post that I was writing? I suppose since it's a blog, right, it's meant to be public, but maybe I'm still thinking, should I publish it or not? And maybe I lose my laptop, maybe whatever. I have the same problem on mobile phones. you don't know how secure the device is for that individual. Do they have, a hard password on their phone? It would be a great thing to find out, because maybe your application can be a little bit less secure and you don't have to put up so many walls for getting into something sensitive. If you have this knowledge that, hey, this user has really locked down their device, right? So you can put a bunch of stuff in the app cache, and them losing it, or somebody gaining access, or me sitting down after you at the same terminal and checking the app cache. I mean, it's kind of like it can open up big holes. So I think it's a really big responsibility that we as developers have to take on to use this power.
Yeah, and that actually plays very. It leads into the issue that you were just talking about of working in other countries, right? So we can assume that if someone's writing a blog post in Iran that it's meant to be public, they might be writing it for.
Doesn't mean they want to know who's writing it in many cases. So, one interesting thing about this is that WordPress obviously isn't just used for blogs anymore at this point. Although in one case where it is used as blogs is the United States intelligence community actually has like 60,000 blogs behind firewalls where they're actually sharing information between agencies in part using WordPress. That is highly sensitive information,
Exactly.
and they don't really want to be synchronizing that. I don't know if anyone saw this recently, the idea of a super cookie. This was probably circulated around about a year or two ago originally. So the idea that this cookie can pretty much find its way onto your system to the point where you can't really erase it. So it's not just saving a cookie anymore, it's also saving it into application cache and local storage and all of these different ways of saving this cookie to the point where if you tried to delete it, you probably won't. Which starts with security and then also gets into tracking. The idea of do not track technology, which just finally landed in Chrome about, a week ago. I can't imagine why Chrome took 17 months after Firefox to add do not track for ads. And so, you have this issue where, yes, it is very easy to just be embedding information pretty much everywhere and leaving a trail. And it's no longer as simple as just logging out at the coffee shop. It is, in many cases, there are a lot of things that could be going on. And are the browsers keeping up with making sure that things are secure? But also, are the browsers keeping up with making sure that you're attract only the right amount of tracking that you want?
Right. There's a question right there.
Microsoft recently announced that it was going to ship the next version of IE with Do Not Track on.
That's correct.
Are you at all concerned that other browser manufacturers are going to follow suit with that, and then also maybe disable some other things like application caching and local storage that would allow additional tracking?
I think I kind of said earlier on, I think that some of the big companies out there have maybe screwed it up for the rest of us, and we're going to have to be asking permission to do a lot of things. I think it's about finding that very thin line between UX and privacy and security concerns, and doing things in a way that they're the least daunting yet protective. So I think the bigger problem with the IE10 thing is now that they're going to ship it on by default, the advertising industry has said, well, if you're going to ship it on by default, we're just going to ignore your flag because we can't tell if the user really meant to do that. So, hello, it's a flag. It says don't track. It's very simple. But they're deciding not to honor IE10 when the flag's set on. So I think it's a space that's becoming more and more visible to a lot of people. Some through unfortunate gaffes, some through just people are wising up as well. They see that there's billions of dollars being thrown around in an industry that deals with sort of reselling your data, and some people just want to be part of that, maybe. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch it unfold, but I think that the browser manufacturers, device manufacturers, operating system manufacturers can all help this ecosystem by giving us some of these clues, like is this device really locked down? For an individual user, can I do some more sensitive things on it? That they can help us along as developers.
So, with regards to tracking at least, this is really interesting. Do not track defaulting to on. Is anyone really going to go ahead and turn that off? You know what? Actually, I'd like to be tracked today. And at the same time, is anyone actually going to, in the right mind, after finding that option, not going to turn it on? And so the question at that point is tracking even viable? Does it even make sense? If the advertisers start to just ignoring this, well, that's all good, but how much of the advertising actually goes through, in many cases, Google? How much of that do they actually control? So if Google is actually going to need to back this, and they're not trying to flout security things with frames and Safari, and they got fined by the FTC, I think, something like $20,000. It was like, wow, that was a lot of money for them, over just basically trying to get around this idea of don't track. A few things though, with regards to at least WordPress, we're not tracking anything. We don't care. We want people. I mean, our biggest number one goal is democratizing publishing. If we can get everyone to be able to publish, whether you're in Iran or whether you're here, whatever it is you're doing, that's the number one thing. In fact, if anything, we want to make it more difficult for governments to be able to track. WordPress.com is blocked in like 6 countries right now. That's a problem. You have someone suddenly writing a post on one little blog, and suddenly, a tenth of the web is just blocked because they just decide, the Chinese government decided that they don't want to be reading this. I mean, the Chinese government blocked the NewYorkTimes.com 2 weeks ago over a big article. So, I mean, for us, I don't want to see tracking anywhere. Certainly, we're not getting into it. The other thing, too, about things being disabled, that's kind of the nice thing about we're still working in the era of progressive enhancement, and I don't think that's ever going to leave. We're still at the point where we're going to be developing things where it would be great if this can be used, and if not, we're going to have to assume that it might not be there. So whether that's, right now we're dealing with older, crappier browsers, but at the same time also we're dealing with someone turned off this feature, and that's definitely going to have to be something that we keep in mind.
Follow up.
We're finding for some of our clients that they've decided they're going to put their browser in privacy mode all the time. And so you can't even store cookies. I mean, so they're taking it to the extreme. And I assume in privacy mode, when you have application cache, that disables that as well. I don't know.
I'm actually not sure. With privacy mode, though, cookies can be stored. They're gone the moment the window closes. So and that's at the same time that is what the user chooses to do. It's no different than if the user chooses to proxy all of their information or whatever it is, their internet is going to be slower. That's a choice they're going to have to make. So obviously there are ways to progressively enhance things. There are ways to make things a little more secure. Sometimes they're butting heads, sometimes they're not.
I just wanted to go back to a topic that you touched upon earlier, Andrew, which is the sort of trend of back-end functions moving to the front end. And as it relates to working in the sort of global market, you can start to do really sophisticated things with translation. And so I'm wondering if WordPress is tackling that, or do you let your community handle translations?
Yeah, this is actually really interesting. So in our case, we crowdsource our translations across a number of teams. And so currently WordPress gets translated into something like 42 different languages, and a lot of the other plugins and themes also get translated into nearly as many. So it doesn't really affect too much in terms of how things are moving from side to side. But if you look at the code progressing from the back end to JavaScript and whatnot, what you are seeing immediately is that we now need to dynamically translate things in JavaScript way more than we used to. Right. And that obviously, in many cases, can slow things down because we're dealing now with a few hundred to a few thousand strings that we're trying to calculate on the fly. Translation is not fun at all, and you can't just throw fragments of strings together. It just doesn't work. So it definitely, that's kind of a performance thing in many cases. The nice thing is that we've gotten good enough at it that we can make it not entirely suck. That's like our new trademark, I guess. So, but yeah, that's kind of the aspect there with translations there are ways to do it. There's no good API out there. There's nothing in HTML5 that's just, hey, you can magically start using this API to translate things. It just doesn't happen yet.
Yeah, I think a trend that I've been noticing certainly is that people are sort of, like you said, pushing up the stack a lot. And so, frameworks like Rails now, their purpose is more to deliver JSON into the browser, and then you pick it up with a templating library like underscore JS or something, and render out your pages and so on. So there's definitely more and more of that moving to the browser level, and less of it happening on the back end.
At the same time, it's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot with this. If you look at Twitter, for example, instead of leveraging the history API for push state with URLs, what they ended up doing instead is they use the hash bangs in URLs, which is just really a terrible experience. It's not forwards compatible. They were basically single-handedly ruining the web, in many people's opinions, for how terrible this idea was of let's just implement this. And they didn't really think about it, and they've been working on rewinding it, and they finally have. But it's very easy to take all these APIs and actually progressively enhance too much, to the point where you're not even, instead of let's just not use the history API and let's just force people to click around, they actually decided let's just not use it at all and let's just build a very much degraded experience. And that really doesn't work too well at all. But just to kind of get into the idea of like Rails, if you're pushing something, this isn't just Rails, this is general. If you're pushing JSON into a browser, then having the browser try and interpret it, that in some cases allows you more manipulation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting more speed. In fact, in many cases, it's going to be slower, because you can do stuff much faster at the binary level than you can in the browser level. And the other thing too is that you're looking at this idea of accessibility. How accessible are some of these applications really, when everything is just dynamically created and they're not really thinking about accessibility from that outlet? They're not thinking about, and accessibility isn't just different ways that people are using computers, in the sense that they might be using a screen reader or something along those lines, or dictation tools, but also it's about different devices. It's about how accessible is this on Apple TV, or how accessible is this on your Android device. And that can really go a long way to, as more things get pushed from the back end to JavaScript to CSS to markup, how can we prevent ourselves from kind of like saying, hey, this is the next big thing, how do we actually slow down and make sure that we're making the right decision?
No, that's a really good point. I think we should preface this entire conversation with, use the right tool for the right job, and pretty much there's nothing that's a silver bullet that you should just jump in with both feet and say I'm going to redo my entire stack or everything based on this new trend. But I think where I've been seeing this and it's been useful is, for example, there's some really cool visualization libraries now where the whole point of the page is to get like the data out to this library and then let you manipulate it. So like a great example is Firefox. Tying in with the whole privacy thing, Firefox built this browser extension called Collusion. It's super cool. You enable it, you go browsing around the web, and you watch it build a graph of who's dropping cookies, where those cookies are going, and it's amazing to watch this thing grow. And the visualization is all HTML5, and it's based on this D3.js library, and it's super cool. And I think that's an area where this kind of templating, pushing data up to the browser, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the word canvas didn't actually come up at all in this conversation, but obviously that's another big area of let's actually draw stuff, but not using Flash in many cases.
That's a really good point, Tarik. The whole idea of educating the user about their experience, right? We've talked a lot about privacy and security from a sort of technical level, but how much of this can we put back in the user's hands without overcomplicating the experience?
I think one of the biggest things is obviously you have to, number one, you have to look at what's the best experiences for the user. In the case of Twitter, it was actually slower for them to be serving their pages this way than it was for them to be using the better APIs. In the case of WordPress, we actually we used the history API for a feature about a year and a half ago, and we realized that it was just a worse user experience for the page to load quicker, believe it or not. It was a worse user experience to just refresh this list of posts. It was better for them to actually go through a page reload because it was less jarring and everything else. So, you can look at number of metrics, but the number one metric still is it a better experience for the user?
Yeah. So we're close to our time here. I wonder if there's any more questions or comments from the room.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I typically find, enterprise applications tend to be a little bit clunky, and there's actually a really good reason for that. It uses sort of the most common set of features available across the widest range of browsers because it is so hard to keep up with all the changes and everything. So it's sort of a decision everybody has to make on their own. Like I was saying earlier, HTML5 is a great way, especially with a framework like HTML5 boilerplate and Bootstrap, which gives you some responsive layout, ability to adjust to screen size and do certain other things, is a really great way of addressing mass audience and not having to retweak things every so often. But you're going to suffer a little bit on what you can do with that and how fast that stuff is going to work.
I think enterprise is kind of in two tracks right now. In one case, a lot of them are just kind of throwing everything in the wind. It's like, okay, fine, use the latest browser, do what you want to do, and they haven't really thought fully about a lot of the ramifications of that. And the other ones are still kind of clinging to the older browsers, the older standards, the you must use IE6 or whatever it is. Back in about a year from now, when Windows XP is no longer supported, I think enterprise is going to have a reckoning. They're going to have to figure out what are we actually going to be doing, what direction should we be going in. And I mean, in many cases, like for us, what we want is we want everyone to be adopting the very latest. We want to be forcibly feeding you the very latest version of WordPress, the very latest version of your browser, everything. Whether enterprise allows us to happen, I don't know. But I mean, certainly with Chrome and Firefox now all building and auto-updating, and even Microsoft saying that they're going to start going in that direction for Internet Explorer 10 and beyond, certainly it's going to be a very big challenge for enterprise to figure out whether they want to stay exactly where they are or they actually want to just suck it up and kind of run forward with everyone else.
Okay, so we've got 6 minutes left. Just to wrap up, 5 years, where's the web going to be from your perspective?
So I think, following sort of this emergence of APIs and JavaScript libraries and everything else that we have, and especially the proliferation of devices, this being an extension of ourselves, quantified self is now huge. Internet of Things. So your car knows exactly how many miles you travel, what day, what the tire pressure is, and there's going to be a lot of data, and big data has already been a huge trend. There's going to be the need to process it, visualize it. We're starting to see APIs or platforms as a service, right? People are offloading logging, they're offloading their databases. You can pretty much a couple clicks and stand up a full stack served from various different places. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more data, a lot more need for users to participate in the conversation because a lot of this data is personal. There's companies like Factual that deal in more of the realm of public data or place data or very factual data, right? But like I said, in the Billionaires Club, half of it deals with personal data. So there's going to be more data on us. We're going to be able to take that data from application to application to application. Each one of those is going to generate more data, right? They're going to infer something, and we'll be able to do some really, really cool mashups based off of Internet of Things and quantified self, I think.
Yeah, data is a great point. If this question was asked 4 or 5 years ago, I mean, pretty much everyone would have been saying, and certainly every VC was saying, social and mobile. And I think we're kind of at that point. We're kind of beyond it. I mean, mobile is right now obviously the biggest adoption. It's the quickest. It lowers, in many cases, points of entry, and it vastly multiplies the number of points of entry. But I think the next step is really this idea of like the omnipresent experience. I was talking earlier about like the phone basically being an extension of your hand right now. Google Glass will basically be just an extension of your eyesight in many cases. This idea of just this unified, continuously connected, whether it's, Google Maps automatically checking you in. I mean, you already have Google. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of Google Latitude, but it's been around for like 4 years now, and it's never really taken off. It's going to eventually, maybe not in that form, but it already kind of has in Foursquare. But Foursquare still is in that kind of that opt-in world. And we're going to get to the point where sharing is going to be completely ubiquitous. You're dealing with the opt-out world. You're dealing with applications rather than websites. And this whole idea of really being continuously connected is going to continue to take off, especially as you begin to see more devices. So you might have a phone now. You might have the Nexus 4, 7, and 10, the 3 different size devices you might have. You might have a phone, you might have a small tablet, and you might have a large tablet. You also have a laptop. Maybe you have a giant monitor sitting on your desktop. But it's at the point where now you actually are sitting up with, maybe up to 5 screens in front of you during the day. What is next beyond that? What other form factors are there? I mean, again, like Google Glass is a great example of how that can really completely change how we're continuously connected and how we're actually sharing. I mean, on one hand, we have to welcome this. On the other hand, we have to be really careful. But I mean, the day when I walk into here and Foursquare automatically checks me in, I think is the day when we've reached that. And I don't think that's going to be 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mentioned them earlier, but if anyone of you have played around with if this then that, they're already sort of, I guess the telling of that time, right? That's about to come. It allows you to link up a bunch of your different applications and react based on events that happen. Upload a picture to Dropbox.
And this is a user tool, not even a developer tool.
Exactly.
Well, thanks very much for your time. We'll certainly have to think about new standards as we move into the future. So thanks for listening, and we'll hand it back over to DC Week.
Hey guys, so thanks so much to our panelists, and we're going to kick off. Thank you. We have a new session here starting in about 5 minutes, so if you're getting up to go to another session, now's the time. If you're staying here, we're asking people to move in. We'll do this again in a minute, but we actually hit capacity in the room, which is kind of exciting.